Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking more about the Civil War, and this video is going to focus mainly on the Battle of Gettysburg. Now before we get started talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, I've actually been to Gettysburg. I was in Gettysburg not too long ago, and I took a tour, and all the places that we're going to talk about that were important places during the Battle of Gettysburg, I've actually been there. They have a lot of monuments in Gettysburg. If you are a person that enjoys history, I heavily encourage you to go to Gettysburg. I went, and I am excited to go again. You know, I would love to go again and spend more time there and just sort of soak up all the history. It's a very historic town. There's a lot of fascinating things there. So if you are a person that enjoys history and you get an opportunity to go to Gettysburg, go. I heavily encourage you to do so. So before we, I'm not going to rabble on more about my vacation, but let's go ahead and get started here. Lee's invasion caused great concern throughout the Union. The Army of the Potomac, now under the leadership of General George Meade, set out to engage the Confederates. Meanwhile, a Confederate unit headed for the town of Gettysburg was hoping to seize footwear from the shoe factory there. On the morning of July 1st, Lee's men ran into several brigades of Union cavalry commanded by General John Buford. Buford's men spread out northwest of town and called for reinforcements. This was the start of the decisive Battle of Gettysburg, which would last for the next 3 days. Now, before we go into talking about some of the fighting, one thing I do want to make everybody aware of, this is the beginning of July. And Gettysburg is geographically not very far away from where we live. Now, I want you to think, what is the weather normally like in July? Very hot. Very humid. It is important to understand whenever I talk about how exhausted the troops are going to be in this battle, that it was swelteringly hot. And a lot of the uniforms worn by the soldiers were made out of wool. Now, have you ever worn a wool suit in the middle of July heat? This is, it's going to play into a lot of the decisions that were made during the battles just due to the heat. So keep that in mind as I go forward talking about this. As the main bodies of both armies converged on Gettysburg, the first day of the fighting went to the Confederates. They pushed the smaller Union force back through the town and onto higher ground to the south. But nightfall halted the Confederate advance. This allowed General Meade to bring up the rest of his army and strengthen the Union position. Union troops dug in along a 2.5-mile defense line stretching from Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill southward along Cemetery Ridge. The Federal line ended at two more rocky hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Now, all of those places that were just mentioned, I have been to in Gettysburg. You know, I have been, in this picture here, this is at Little Round Top, which is the top of a hill. And there are monuments and plaques and things up there, and this place is fascinating. But the main important landmark out of this whole battle is going to be this place right here, Cemetery Ridge. Cemetery Ridge is where the Union line was set up. This is where their defenses were, and this is where most of the battles are going to be taking place, is near Cemetery Ridge. Troubled that the Union now held the high ground, Confederate General James Longstreet regretted, "It would have been better had we not fought at all than to have left undone what we did." General James Longstreet. Now, what this is meaning is, while the Confederates had won the first day of the battles, the position that they had pushed the Union in actually put the Union at a great advantage. It put them up on hills on top of ridges. And if you are in a conflict, taking the high ground is going to give you a much bigger advantage. For example, what's easier, running uphill or running downhill? Running downhill, obviously. Another thing, if you have to run uphill towards your enemy, they're going to be shooting down at you, and what's going to be behind them? Probably the sun. You're going to have to like squint and try to see them with the sun right behind them. It's just another advantage that being on the high ground is going to give you. Confederates suffer a stunning blow. As July 2nd dawned, Lee's men prepared to assault both ends of the Union line. Lee ordered one force to move against the northern part of Meade's defenses, while General Longstreet attacked the southern end of Cemetery Ridge. Late in the afternoon, Longstreet's troop charged against a large body of Union soldiers that had mistakenly abandoned Little Round Top and moved westward off Cemetery Ridge. The two sides hammered at each other for several hours in some of the fiercest fighting of the war. The rebels, however, failed to breach the Union line. So, this was actually a mistake by the Union that had momentarily left Little Round Top to pursue some Confederate soldiers. They had given up their advantageous position in order to chase some of the soldiers. Well, they are going to go back to Little Round Top because they're going to realize the mistake that they've made. Meanwhile, Union troops had noticed the undefended position on Little Round Top. They hurried forward just in time to meet the gray tide of Confederates rushing uphill. Anchoring the Union defense of the hilltop was a main unit under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. Chamberlain's men stood firm against numerous Confederate attacks, but their numbers and ammunition eventually dwindled. Chamberlain responded by ordering a bayonet charge that butchered many of the exhausted enemy. Hundreds of Confederates surrendered, and the fighting drew to a close. Night fell, and the Union still held the high ground. So at Little Round Top, some Union soldiers had left, but this Colonel Joshua Chamberlain noticed that Little Round Top was undefended, and Confederates were going to try to take the hill. Well, that was going to put the Confederates in an advantageous position. So Chamberlain rushes his men up Little Round Top to secure the top of this hill. And as they get to the top of the hill, they get up to the hill and they look down the other side, and they see just swarms of Confederate soldiers coming up towards them. So they immediately open fire. Now, I have been, once again, sorry to keep talking about my experiences, but I have been to the exact position where this took place. And the hill that the Union soldiers rushed up was wooded. It was woods. They were coming through the woods up this hill. So once they get up to the top and it breaks and there's an opening, they get to the other side and they look down, and it is a very rocky hill. There's big boulders all over this hill. And they get up and they look down the other side, and there's boulders, and gray-suited Confederates are rushing up towards them. So they immediately begin opening fire. Now the hill that is going up toward Little Round Top, it is very scraggly terrain. There's big boulders, like I've said before, jutting up out of the ground. It's very, very rough terrain. Actually, that whole area, locals referred to it as the Devil's Den. The Devil's Den, and then right next to it was called the Slaughter Pen. So, this was not good territory to have to fight on. So, Chamberlain and his soldiers are in a great position. They are opening fire. They are mowing down these rebels left and right. They're falling left and right. Pow, pow, pow. And they run out of ammunition. So he orders a bayonet charge. Now, if you don't know what a bayonet is, a bayonet is what they would do is they would take their rifles, and at the end of it they would put a long knife about like this long on the end of their bayonet. They would screw it down onto the end of their gun so they could still fire their gun, but if they ran out of ammunition, they still have a weapon. They still have a spear. So Chamberlain orders all of his men who are out of ammunition to charge downhill into these soldiers, and it was, the tour guide that I took described it as a bloodbath. There were many Confederate soldiers who the Union just descended upon them and was just stabbing left and right, slashing here, slashing there. And the Confederate soldiers were already exhausted. Remember, this was extremely hot weather. They're running uphill, and this had been going on all day. Whenever this was happening, they didn't sleep in till 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, then get up and have a nice breakfast and, hey Jim, how are you? No, there was none of that. They were up at dawn and they fought until the sun went down, and this is towards the end of the day. So the Confederate soldiers are exhausted, they're overheating. One tactic that the Union did was they would locate natural water sources, and then they would just post a few sharpshooters nearby, and whenever Confederate scouts would come to fill canteens to take back to the soldiers, shoot them. They would just kill all the people that came to get water at these natural sources. So a lot of these soldiers, these Confederate soldiers, are also going to be dehydrated. So it was just a losing situation for the Confederates left and right. And after so many of them had just been butchered by this bayonet charge, hundreds threw down their weapons, put up their hands, they surrendered. Pickett's charge fails. Lee was not discouraged. Despite opposition from Longstreet and believing that victory was still within reach, the Confederate commander attacked one more time. The result was disastrous. In the early afternoon of July 3rd, Lee commenced an artillery barrage aimed at the center of the Union line. He had hoped his cannon would break up the Union defenses in advance of an infantry attack on Cemetery Ridge. There's Cemetery Ridge coming up again. When Lee's men, including a division under General George Pickett, marched toward the ridge, thousands of Confederates were mowed down by Union rifle and cannon fire. Now, this was one thing that is important to know about the weapons that were used in the Civil War. The bullets that they would fire out of their rifles were about as big around as my little finger. So whenever if you were shot in the chest, the bullet was about as big around as my little finger. The exit wound on the back was about as big as my hand. So one shot from these rifles is devastating. These guys, soldiers today, whenever they go out to fight, they wear body armor. They wear Kevlar and bulletproof armor and things like that. These guys, as you can see in this painting here, now it is a painting, it's not a picture, but they're just fighting in like t-shirts and pants. They don't have any sort of armor or any sort of protective clothing at all. So whenever they get shot, it's directly into skin. There's nothing that's going to try to break that impact. So getting shot in the Civil War was pretty much a death sentence. The Confederate forces had a moment of success as Pickett's charge had momentarily broken the Union line. Now, whenever you can break through a defensive line, that can be devastating for the defending military. If their line is broken, that can be it. That can be the moment that the tide turns like that. And Pickett's charge momentarily broke the Union line, and historians agree that the moment that Pickett's charge broke the Union line was the closest the Confederacy ever came to winning the Civil War. To their dismay, quick thinking on behalf of Union forces destroyed the rebels who had broken through and quickly reformed their line. They did what was called a hinge maneuver. Whenever their line was set up like this, and Pickett's charge broke through in the middle, meaning that the Confederates were able to come in and fight on both sides. Well, whenever they noticed that their line was broken, they did a hinge maneuver. So the people, like out here, hinged around and came in and reformed the center of the line. And they reformed their line, and there is a monument in Gettysburg at the exact position where the line was broken, and it's called the high water mark. And it is called the high water mark because that is the moment that the Confederacy came the closest to winning the Civil War. But Pickett's charge failed. There was a momentary success, there was a brief glimmer of hope for the Confederacy, and the Union quickly dashed that. After the failure of Pickett's charge, Lee ordered the general to reposition his division. "General Lee," replied Pickett, "I have no division now." The Battle of Gettysburg was over. On the battlefield lay more than 50,000 dead and wounded. About half of these were Confederates, nearly a third of Lee's fighting force. Lee abandoned his invasion of the North and led his limping army back into Virginia. The South had suffered a crushing defeat. It would never again attempt to fight on Union soil. Now the Battle of Gettysburg, is known as the bloodiest battle on American soil. 50,000 dead and wounded. It was said that crows and vultures were just everywhere in Gettysburg for days after. I hate to be gross and macabre with you, but that's just the way things were. People said this. There have been historical accounts that said the smell of Gettysburg was just thick in the air for days afterwards because there was just so much death and blood, and it was just it is the bloodiest battle on American soil. The Gettysburg Address. In November 1863, Lincoln came to the Gettysburg battlefield to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen soldiers. There he delivered his Gettysburg Address. He described the Civil War as a struggle to fulfill the Declaration of Independence and to preserve a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Today, the speech is recognized as an enduring statement of American values and goals. Now this monument I have pictured here, that is a monument that on both of these tablets next to this bust of Lincoln is all of the words of the Gettysburg Address. Now that monument is not in the exact position where he gave the Gettysburg Address. This is a picture that I took whenever I was in Gettysburg, and this monument notes the exact location where President Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. The location where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address is now marked with a National Soldiers Monument. This is a picture of the monument I took when I was in Gettysburg. Alright, we have a quote here from Abraham Lincoln. It says, We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, November 19, 1863. The Union's total war. Coming within a day of each other, the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg dealt a severe blow to the Confederacy. Lee's troops were in retreat and the Mississippi River was in Union hands. Gone too was any hope for the Confederacy to win recognition from Britain or France. The war was not over. Indeed, the Confederacy would still win some victories, such as that at Chickamauga, Georgia in the fall of 1863. In general, however, the situation of the South was dire. Okay, here's a graphic that shows some of the statistics and numbers of the different battles of the Civil War. If that's something you're interested in, you can take a look, but I'm not going to read it to you. General Ulysses S. Grant supported harsh tactics to destroy the Confederate countryside and weaken civilians' ability to support the troops. Now, before I continue, there is going to be a quote coming up that uses some language that I do not condone and I would not want used in my classroom, but it is a historical quote and I will read it in its entirety because it is important to understand the words and everything that were used back then to really get what the true meaning is. So I'm going to use all of the words that are in the quote. Grant sets his sights on Richmond. Lincoln recalled General Grant from the Mississippi Valley in early 1864 to take charge of the entire Union military effort. The president knew that Grant would accept nothing less than victory. He was correct. Grant set his sights on the Confederate capital of Richmond. I propose to fight it out, he declared, if it takes all summer. Grant's campaign did last all summer and for months beyond. He engaged Lee's army in a series of ferocious battles. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor. Grant's strategy was to inflict more losses on the Confederates than their limited resources could withstand. The cost of Grant's relentless assault was horrifying. Tens of thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers fell on the battlefields of Virginia. In the North, public outrage began to grow. So Grant is taking a new strategy where his goal is to inflict as much loss and pain on the South as he can. This is called total war. Grant's attack did not target the South's military forces alone. He followed a strategy of total war, which meant striking civilian as well as military targets. The purpose of total war is to weaken not just an enemy's armies, but also the economy that supports the enemy and the overall will of the people to fight. The South was suffering serious losses that it could not hope to replace. Now, whenever it says civilian targets, I'm not saying that they were going in and killing civilians. No, they would tell the civilians to leave, and as the picture I've included in the background here, they might burn down a farm. They might destroy a factory. They might essentially take anything that wasn't nailed down, and if they couldn't take it, they would burn and destroy it, because they did not want the South to have anything. Sherman presses east to the sea. The Union's total war strategy was also implemented by General William Tecumseh Sherman. In May 1864, he set out from the Tennessee-Georgia border with 60,000 troops on a 250-mile march to capture the port of Savannah, Georgia. During his march to the sea, Sherman ordered his men to get supplies by looting along the way, then to destroy anything of potential value left behind. Cutting a 60-mile wide swath through Georgia, Sherman's army tore up railroad tracks, destroyed buildings, and vandalized hundreds of private homes. With Union forces closing in on Atlanta, Confederate troops abandoned the city. Sherman's men occupied it on September 2nd and forced the residents to leave. When the mayor asked Sherman to reconsider his order, the general responded with a letter. You might as well appeal against the thunderstorm as against these terrible hardships of war. They are inevitable, and the only way the people of Atlanta can hope once more to live in peace and quiet at home is to stop the war. We don't want your Negroes, or your horses, or your houses, or your lands. But we do want and will have a just obedience to the laws of the United States. That we will have, and if it involves the destruction of your improvements, we cannot help it. William T. Sherman, letter to James Calhoun, September 12, 1864. Once Atlanta was emptied, Union troops burned it to the ground. Sherman the Brute, as Southerners called him, continued eastward and captured Savannah in late December. General Sherman is known as one of the most ruthless and effective commanders that the United States military has seen. This man held no mercy for his enemies, and he employed the tactic of total war to the fullest. He burnt down in the entirety of Atlanta, Georgia, because he knew that it was a major city and the South could use that. Now, like I said, he did not kill civilians. He made the civilians leave. He knew that they were not fighters, they were not soldiers. So he made them leave the city and then burnt everything to the ground. Lincoln wins re-election. As 1864 drew to a close, Lincoln had much to celebrate. While his military commanders were winning victories on the battlefield, he had won re-election in November. The campaign had been difficult. Lincoln had lost some support even in his own party. Some Republicans criticized the president for grasping too much authority. Others charged that he was not fully committed to ending slavery. Democrats, fractured into several factions, finally nominated George McClellan, the popular former Union commander. Lincoln's presidency had seemed in jeopardy. However, Union victories boosted his popularity. Many Union soldiers loyal to Lincoln were allowed to go home to vote. When the ballots were in, McClellan won 45% of the popular vote, but Lincoln received 212 of the 233 electoral votes. The re-election of Abraham Lincoln destroyed any last Confederate hopes that the North would cave in and negotiate a peace. So whenever Lincoln was re-elected, the Confederacy knew that there was no way that this war was going to have a peaceful ending for them that would continue the existence of the Confederacy. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this video. I do apologize. This is a rather long video. I'm sorry for that. I hate to put out videos this long, but there was a lot to cover here. The Battle of Gettysburg is one of the most historic battles in the Civil War and in wars in general. So there was a lot to cover here. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye.